Welcome to this tutorial on how to paint Fireforge Sergeants. These are going to be painted as Templar Sergeants as part of a project I'm doing for a friend. It's a long held project he's finally getting off the ground. So you'll see the guys have all been undercoated, and they've been undercoated in German Camo black brown. We're going to be using a layering technique to paint these. I'm going to be painting these, the one I've got in my hand, I'll be painting that, and Mrs Panzer Schule is going to paint the crossbowman. So we're going to show you how this layering technique is very easy to learn. Mrs Panzer Schule is a novice painter. You know, like, she's not got any kind of history in wargaming or painting. So that to hopefully give you a bit of confidence that this is a technique you can follow. Now, a little word of construction. First of all, these are from the Sergeant's box set, but these are going to be leaders. So, for instance, the foot sergeant there, I've given a lance and arms from the mounted Sergeant's box set. I've added a bit of extra length to the lance so that it reaches ground level. I've used a little bit of plastic art, thin plastic art, to create a cross on the front of his padded armour, and a cloak. This from the mounted Templar box. I've had to amend that slightly with some green stuff so it sits right around his neck. You can see there's a little clasp I've put on there. But it's just a nice little extra bit of detail that you can do with these plastic kits, which is great. You know, there's so many modelling possibilities and you get so much extra stuff, especially when you combine boxes. You know, so don't chuck these sprues out until you're confident you don't need them anymore. I've got so much old sprues kicking about, it's a bit embarrassing. But there you go, he's going to be the foot sergeant leader. He's got a shield that I've still to add, but he's looking significantly different from the other guys in the unit. And then the crossbow leader is fairly standard crossbow figure, except I've given him a sword and cut the scabbard so the hilt of the sword's not in the scabbard. Once again, plastic art on the front to make a cross on the padded armour, and he'll stand out from the crowd just by his raised sword, if nothing else. So camo, German camo, black brown, undercoat all over, and these guys are ready to paint. So here's Mrs Panzer Schule starting with the first layer of paint. This is chocolate brown, and you can see she's painting the lines of the padding on the armour and leaving the German camo black brown in the gaps in the recesses. Now, if we can do this because this is a brown colour, if the colour itself was lighter, you might not want to leave so many really dark shades, and you'd want to use 3 layers of paint. In this case, we're only going to use 2 layers. We're going to use chocolate brown with a highlight of US Field Drab. Mrs Panzer Schule uses a magnifying glass, by the way, that's why you're seeing it like this, but you'll also see me painting it without a magnifying glass. And Mrs Panzer Schule, I'm recording her at normal speed, you'll see me painting at a higher rate of speed. Here we go now, just so you can see it progressing a bit quicker. But I'm following the same process, just adding a layer. If required, I'll add another coat, but this is a very dark colour, so it'll mostly get done in just the one coat. And just remember, folks, if you can't see it, don't put too much work into it. For instance, under the cloak, I don't have to worry too much about what's going on there. Now there's a highlight going down using a smaller brush. We typically use, if you let's say use Army Painter, using like a character brush and an insane detail brush, those kind of sizes. This is more like the insane detail size, and it's just a very thin line of the highlight colour. The highlight colour works best for this layering technique, where it's placed directly against any shade, vertically or directly above it if it's horizontal. And then you can see as well a little shade line down the side, only on one side. You don't want to be too stripy, you just need to create that look of folds. and you can also remember to put a little shade line at the top of the bottom of each of those lines of padding. Make sure the brush is wet enough to let the paint flow, but not so wet that when it flows off the brush it pulls on the figure or runs off the figure. If you're dragging the paint off the brush then the paint's too dry. And always just on one side of these folds, otherwise it's just going to look far too busy, be far too stripy. Patience is needed certainly at this point, folks. And try and keep the lines all on the same side to suggest the light possibly hitting it all from the same direction. But now we're building up a nice bit of depth to the padded armour. And once again, if you can't see it, folks, don't worry about putting too much work into it. Now we're going to be using painting on some white, which is always difficult. We give it an undercoat of London grey. Then we'll be using off-white as the main coat and white as a little highlight. Now you don't want to be leaving a lot of the German dark grey under the grey, because the grey is now your shade colour. Remember before I talked about having to use 3 layers depending on the colour you're using. So here I'm just leaving some, or Mrs Panzer Schule is just leaving some German Camo black grey to frame, brown to frame where the grey is going. And then we can start leaving some of that London grey to create the folds, the shade in the folds, with the off-white going on as the layer. And you can see Mrs Panzer Schule doing the same here. With shades as well, you don't want the shade colour to be the dominant colour, folks, so remember to put plenty of the mid-range, the mid colour, the main colour on. If you have too much shade colour of any kind, it dominates and it becomes the main colour, if you understand. The shade is there to help give depth to what you're doing. And then I think we're just going to see the arm here. Now you can see lining up the figure is really important. You might see some crazy painting angles just to get it on video, but lining up the figure so you can get a nice clean brush stroke is the best plan. And you'll see when we're painting like arms, sleeves, anything like that, it's about painting on a series of lines and then joining the lines up so that in your first pass, so to speak, you're finding the highlights, leaving the folds, and in the second pass you're filling in so there's not too much shade left. And white, remember folks, you've got to get it on quite wet. Don't try and put it on dry because it will just dry lumpy and horrible. So put it on a little bit wet, let it dry fully, and then give it another coat. And then just working around the face here, making sure there's a little bit of that undercoat German Camo black brown between the white and the face itself. And then once again painting lines just so that we're creating folds. And you can do that on really flat features too. You can create folds on something that's really flat simply by leaving a bit of shade colour. And then just to give a little bit more brightness in certain high points, we're using pure white. Not too much of this though. And you know, you can get a softer transition as well, remember folks, by using a lighter grey. Now we're using green grey with a highlight of Panzer AC's Splinter Camo base for the leggings. It's just a nice sort of bleached out kind of colour. And you can see again forming those lines, following the shape of the figure. Where there is no shape, you can create your own shape, as I said, just by leaving a bit of shade colour. You could use a US Drab olive drab as a shade colour instead of the brown. Here we've kind of cut corners a bit, but if you wanted that third layer, because this is quite a light base colour, US olive drab is a good dark colour that complements more the green grey. And then you can see me putting thin lines. Once again, make sure that the paint is flowing off the brush but staying nice and controlled, and I'm placing that above the shade. So light's coming down. Typically you'll have a light area, then the shade underneath it. The fold will be underneath the area that is more pronounced. Oh, sorry folks, going out of focus there. We are seeing a bit of Mrs Panzer Schule's hair there folks, but we try and keep that out of shot as much as possible. But you can see her there, just carefully placing the brush and then drawing it across the feature. If you kind of fly at it, you know, like try and place the brush and then draw it in the one movement, you can get it wrong. Whereas if you place the brush so you've got it in the right spot and then draw it along the direction you want it to go, you're going to get a much more accurate highlight. And you notice these highlights are really quite small, but they make a real big difference to the outcome because of how bright they are. Now this is US Field Drab on the scabbards and you use a highlight of I think old wood on that. Panzer Aces Old Wood. Now in the crossbow we're starting with a different kind of brown. We're using German Camo medium brown here for the crossbow, so it's got a different tone. These guys are quite brown. You don't want to overdo it and have them just, you want each feature fair enough to be brown but to stand out from each other. So we're just being careful to leave some shade, for instance, where the quarrel will sit, some shade around the other features of the crossbow. And as this is brown colour, you might only need one coat to do this. The lighter colours, you're going to need two coats, for instance the green grey, but that's okay because you can fill in, remember, paint your lines to create your folds and then fill in with your second coat. Now the metal parts here have been given an undercoat of black, and now they're getting a coat of basalt grey, leaving a little fringe of black where the metal meets the other parts of the crossbow. That frames it nicely, frames it in a sharper way than the German Camo black brown would. So just working around the features. Now we're painting the arms of the crossbow here metal. I've seen them metal, I've seen them brown. I think for this figure the metal is just going to give the crossbow more shape against the rest of the brownness of these uniforms. Now as I said, Mrs Panzer Schule is a novice painter. She's painted hardly any figures in her time. She's clearly got nice steady hands to get this done, but she's following the technique that's been shown her so that she understands where everything goes, where the paints go, where the layers go, the highlights and the shades. Now the next coat here is London grey, and we're leaving a bit of the basalt grey. So it's like the shade coat. London grey is the main coat, and we want to create a metallic patina here without using metallics. You can obviously just use metal paints, as you'll see later on when I'm painting the larger metallics. You can use metal paints for this, or get a non-metallic look, which is more interesting. Now this is deck tan for a little bit of a glint, you know, just to catch the eye, and then a highlight of US Field Drab on the edges of the wooden parts of the crossbow. And then we're back to Panzer Aces new wood to start building up the various ropes and ties and string and so on that we've got on the crossbow. And you can see there's little bits of shade being left, which is really going to help the shape of the string of the crossbow really stand out. Same again with the bindings for the crossbow arms. And then we're doing a highlight of Iraqi sand. Just little dots, as you can see. We're not trying to remove or paint over all of the old wood colour, but it's just helping that pop, get a nice degree of brightness. Now the boots and the belts are leather brown, so it's brown on brown again here, folks. Only need the the layer colour, no need for a shade colour. I'm going to highlight them with orange brown, which is a very, very bright contrast, so you need to be careful. You see, I'm just putting tiny, tiny little bits on, but it gives it a kind of worn, leathery edge, which once again is different from the highlights used elsewhere in the figure to make them stand out. Now the arms were undercoated with German camo grey, German grey. The cloak was undercoated black. Now I am giving that a main coat, quite strong main coat of German grey again, because black's quite hard to shade, so you've got to lighten it, and the same goes for the flag. Remembering both sides of the flag, but don't worry about the underside of the cloak. Now we're painting the cross. This is burnt cadmium red. This is going to be the shade colour. And you've got to work on the shape. You may have to touch that up with some black as you go. Cross on the front, getting the same treatment. And then just flat, just red, ordinary red, following the lines I've already painted. Same on the chest there, and then the highlight is scarlet. You can go with a lighter highlight if you want something really bright. Perhaps on the chest would be appropriate, just to make it stand out a bit more. And then we're back to London grey for a highlight on the cloak. Very sparing highlight. We just want to accentuate some of the high points, the top and the trailing edge. And you can use this for some smaller metallics as well. And then same on the flag. And that's going to give something which is black a bit of depth, but still basically look black. Oh, I'm doing the eyes there now. You don't have to do the eyes, folks. If you do, I suggest you paint from the side with a white line and then a very small dark line down the middle. Now here we go. This is metallics. Well, you know, I'm doing something a little bit like blending. I'm putting the colour on and then softening the bottom edge. Sorry, I'm out of shot there, folks. And I'll probably take a couple of approaches to each area. I'm using Basalt grey and then London grey as the first sort of blend, but you can just use metallic colours, wash and dry brush. But I just thought I'll show you this just so you can see something a bit different from the absolute basics. When you're brushing, always remember to brush towards the area you want the most intensity to remain, which can be tricky depending on the shape of the helmet or of the sword or other weapon. So I'm brushing up or brushing out depending on the shape. And then I'm using Deck Tan as a highlight, applying it in the same way again but in smaller quantities, and then brushing out, brushing up, so that the highlights have been concentrated. And then Deck Tan again, just to put on some edge highlights and catch some high points just for that metallic glint. This can be tricky, folks, but it can give a really nice soft but metal looking finish. And then I'm giving it a very, very soft glaze with azure, a light blue colour. You can also use a dark blue colour if you want a darker finish, and that just softens everything once again, like a filter. Now the skin, I'm using a base colour of German Camo Pale Brown, then model colour Bronze Flesh Tone, and then Flat Flesh as a highlight. Paint the face as you know a face. You know, you've got nose, lips, chin, cheekbones. You know, paint the eyes first, and then just build up from that, folks. You can also give it a bit of a wash. I do that sometimes. I've not done it here, but I can use purple, maybe crimson, just to give it a bit of warmth. But these are nice simple movements. Put the highlights on the raised, the final highlights on the raised points. For instance, below the eyes, the light hits below the eyes, hits down the nose, on the lips, and such likes. Now the staff, I'm doing something different again here. I've given it an undercoat of Splinter Camo base, and then I'm putting dots of little wet dots of US Field Drab all over it. And just before it dries, I then, with the brush being clean but damp, I'm just dragging the paint up and down. And what that does is the paint that's dried, the Field Drab, leaves a little ring of dried paint. Don't rub that off, leave it there. It kind of adds wood grain. You know, make it all different sizes, different positions, and you're going to get the sort of staff-like colour, but it's got a grainy look to it. And that's us nearly finished these guys, folks. There'll be some still pictures coming up, and at the end a link to the finished units. Here I'm using, as you can see there, a thick soft gel for the sand. Be very careful when you're putting it in the sand, folks. It's very soft, just let it sit in the sand and flick the sand on top. Finish the bases and you're done.